This module, we're going to talk about memory and metacognition. Now, this may seem like a strange way to start off, but I know this happens to all of us. You ever meet somebody and within minutes you can't remember their names? Why does that happen? Well, it's because you're really not paying attention, right? You're not making an effort to take what you just heard and place it into memory. So I'm going to do a little exercise here. I want you to meet my neighbors, Ben and Robin. Now, this is a true story. I met these folks years ago, and when I went up to introduce myself, I said I'm going to make an effort to remember their names. And so when they told me the name Ben and Robin, I think, okay, how can I remember this? Well, Ben, notice, is very tall, and Robin is very short and petite. Now, this is not the real Ben and Robin, but this is what they look like. And so the memory technique that I used to remember their names is I thought of Big Ben in London with a robin on the side of Big Ben. Now, why this is important, I'll come back to later. Metacognition, this idea of thinking about your own thinking. So here's kind of a good visual. For example, if you're going to take an exam, right, what went well and what can improve? You need to really understand that if you didn't do well, why? And then adjust your study techniques to fill in the blanks of the problems that you didn't understand and why did not understand it. Oftentimes, before you read something, before you go to a lecture, what do you expect to find out from this? Okay, so you wire up your brain in a way that it's ready to receive information because you have a context to put it into. What do you already know about this? And so it's always easier to remember something if you can attach it to prior learning. Many subjects like mathematics builds on previous concepts. And so it's always easier to attach it to something you already know. And again, what needs to change to make this better? You should always be asking yourself, looking at the feedback, what went well, what didn't go well, and why, and then make the adjustments. And of course, mindset is underlies all of this. You have to have the correct mindset with your approach to learning. And so one of the questions you're going to be asked to reflect on is the difference between studying and learning. And so here's an example. On the left is a student doing homework with photomath. In photomath, you just take a picture of the problem, it'll give you the answer. So some students of mine will say they studied, um, but they're using photomath to solve their homework problems, and so they didn't learn anything. Okay, so you can study for 2 hours and learn absolutely nothing, as opposed to on the right is an example of the old-fashioned pencil and paper where you're solving problems, you're thinking about problems. What do I understand? How can I apply it? But don't think for a minute that something like photomath is going to teach you anything. So many of my students, if they don't do well on an exam, will come up and it'll be something like, I thought I understood this material, Mr. McKenna. I understood everything you said in class. Understanding an explanation is not the same as being able to do the work independently. So again, metacognition, how do I know what I know? Try to teach it. Dr. McGuire mentioned this a few times in her video, that teaching is the best metacognitive technique. And so along with this is this idea of Bloom's taxonomy. It's this hierarchy of learning. And so let's just look at an example. So in my math classes, say we're doing quadratics, and one way to solve a quadratic equation is using the quadratic formula. So you have to remember the quadratic formula. I'll have some number of students that, despite me repeatedly telling them that you're going to have to be able to remember the quadratic formula, they cannot even correctly write the formula. But at the most base level, there are things you just have to remember. And memorization techniques, you have a video to take a look at that. But you don't want to be at the remember stage. The understanding stage, one level up, would be, okay, if you have the quadratic formula, if you remember it, can you apply it? In other words, if given a quadratic equation, do you know that x is what I'm solving and a, b, and c are coefficients in that quadratic equation? And then applying it is you have a problem, maybe a word problem, and for analysis, you understand that the equation representing this problem is quadratic in nature, and you go, oh, by the way, I can use the quadratic formula to solve it. So you've bumped this up another level. And you can keep going. The analyze might be how is this derived, but that's not necessarily maybe an undergraduate level. Certainly in grad school, you may look at some higher level stuff, but you certainly should be in the first three levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Just remembering something is not going to be good enough in college. Okay, so there's two types of students. The passive students that just sit there and think that maybe there's an easy button that they can hit and make it all, somehow magically enter into their brain versus the engaged student. Okay, it's a choice. You've got to think about and engage with what you're trying to learn. If you just are passive, you're never really going to understand or learn the material. When I do this in my live classes and I ask these series of questions, everybody says the same thing in terms of the answers. So this is kind of the zoo tiger student, that wants to stay in the cage and be safe. Passive students sit in the back of the classroom. Passive students are always on their phone before class. Passive students never ask questions because they don't know what to ask. The instructor, I'll know their name, but beyond that, they become somewhat invisible to the instructor because they never engage. And then what is the passive student doing during class? Often they're on a laptop doing anything other than probably what they should be doing on that laptop. Everybody can accurately describe a passive student. Okay, as opposed to the jungle tiger student, okay, the engaged student. They sit up front. They're often looking at notes or doing homework before class. They always ask questions frequently. The instructors definitely know them. These are the students that show up for office hours for additional instruction or clarification. And during class, the engaged student is actively involved in the class. These are the students that do very, very well. And again, Dr. McGuire in the video talks about your ability to teach. So you're going to watch this video. I'm not going to go over it much, but just understand that for you to remember something, for you to put it into long-term memory, and it's kind of like a computer hierarchy, that there's some level of rehearsal that has to go on, some technique that you've got to employ in order to be able to take it out of short-term memory where you will forget it very quickly and put it into long-term memory where you can remember it. Okay. And so there's an action required. Some technique has to be applied. And so there's a lot of different memory techniques, and you can watch the video. So I won't go through those here. But you're going to do an exercise, counting the vowel exercise, and there's a system involved in helping you remember the words that you're going to do in this particular exercise. And last but not least, what are their names? Okay, almost every one of my students will remember their name, even though they've never met them. And in many cases, they will remember their name a month, 2 months later. Because why? Because I've implanted an image in their brain of Big Ben with a robin sitting on the side. Okay, that's the kinds of techniques you employ to be able to remember. Okay, so that's a little bit about metacognition and memory. I'll see you in the next module.